Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for Dragon Ball The Breakers. This is on the Xbox Series X, but it probably applies to the Xbox One version as well. I haven't noticed any difference between the Xbox One or Series versions of games, but I can't say how it differs on other platforms. But starting with the movement, we have about a 55% mostly circular dead zone. If you look closely, you can see that it's actually a bit of a gear shape. So in these axial regions, the dead zone seems to flatten out a little bit, creating a slight bit of a cog's tooth for this shape. 55% is a massive dead zone, but because this game only has one movement speed, as you can see, moving slightly beyond the dead zone and pressing the stick fully makes no difference. You can just push the stick fully and the dead zone size really doesn't matter. There is restricted diagonal movement around each axis, so you can see if your stick is within any of these blue regions, you'll be moving in one of four directions. So perfectly left, perfectly right, perfectly up, and perfectly down. And I don't even need a proper reference to demonstrate this because it's very abrupt, especially around the dead zone. You can see here I'm moving perfectly forward, and as soon as I move into the green region, which is where diagonal movement occurs, it's very abrupt. You can see that the diagonal restriction gets smaller the further out you get from the dead zone, and the level of abruptness to the movement decreases, though you can still see a bit of a pivot. Now this pivot indicates that the input is not being rescaled around the dead zone, and what should be happening is that when you pass into this diagonal region, you get a very subtle diagonal, and that allows you to keep your full range of 360-degree angles just being rescaled into these diagonal regions. But when it's not rescaled, you simply lose them. So anything from perfectly straight to this is lost at this point. However, sort of like movement, since there's only one speed, there's no reason not to push the stick fully, and in that case, you're only affected by the edge, where only 10% around each axis is restricted. So this really isn't much of an issue with movement, but you still do lose these angles within that region. For the camera, we have about a 42% dead zone, and I'm not sure what to call this type of dead zone. I've been calling it something like a bloated square or a cornered circle. You can see that these corners are just slightly larger than are just slightly larger than cardinal directions. So requires just a bit more input for that, but the diagonal restriction is exactly the same as movement. So if your stick is anywhere within this blue region, in this case it's moving perfectly left and then perfectly right, and if you move your stick at very obvious directions or angles while within this region, I'm still moving perfectly right. And the exact same with movement. This does not appear to be scaled, so when I break into this diagonal region, you get a very strong diagonal. So perfectly right, and a very strong diagonal. So you just lose those angles the same as with movement. And this actually applies to acceleration as well. So as you can see, when I break right past the dead zone, this starts quite fast. And if we look at the acceleration curve, it actually starts at 10% of your total speed and then builds up gradually to its maximum. So 10% might not seem like a lot, but if you can think of, say, a basic linear curve, you wouldn't hit 10% until if you move 10% into the curve. And if you're using, say, a quadratic curve, you wouldn't get 10% until 30% of the curve. So aside from losing any speed under 10%, you had a lot more stick range dedicated to those precise speeds, whereas here you don't have those precise speeds at all, and you just quickly get into speeds that are unnecessary for smaller movements. This curve actually is a quadratic curve, but it's not. It's scaled around a smaller dead zone size. So if we draw a quadratic curve that fits these points, we can see that it's based around a 15% dead zone. So there's probably a smaller dead zone being masked under this larger dead zone that just displayed. And it's likely that this dead zone is circular. And the reason why I think this is because it's too hard to demonstrate here, but it seems like cardinally this is just a hair slower than diagonally, and that makes sense because if you're moving a bit further in the corners, you should be going faster. And based on the diagonal movement as well as the acceleration, this seems like it's being set up radially. With a curve like this, if it were set up axially, this would have an effect on your diagonal movement, but it doesn't seem like it's working like that. So it could be that there's a circular dead zone underlying this, and it's just being swallowed by this overlaying dead zone, and that would be a good thing because they could just remove this overlying dead zone, and then you'd be left with a 15% circular dead zone with a quadratic curve, which is quite good. Even if that's that's kind of a modest dead zone size, but if they don't want to add dead zone options, bumping this to 20 or 25%, and even reducing the intensity of the curve would still get you a ton more precision than what's currently offered by this cropped curve. It would give you full diagonal movement and properly scaled acceleration. So that would be a pretty great improvement for that. Now, this doesn't matter much for gameplay, mainly because this game doesn't require precision. When you shoot things or when you're in combat, there's some very generous auto-aim, so precision really isn't necessary. Any of these kind of improvements would just make general navigation feel smoother, just making subtle camera movements just all around smoother. But of course, players who are just making large movements, this current system is perfectly fine, and this won't actually improve anyone's gameplay, but it'll just be a nice smoother experience. But that about covers things. So yeah, thanks for watching, and everyone have a good rest of your day.